Bueno, seguimos entonces, ahora no hay break. Seguimos ahora con Jennifer, que va a presentar Herken. De vuelta, esto se parece un poco también a la presentación de Amanda. La idea de Jennifer es, y que yo lo pienso también relacionado al software, la idea de Jennifer no es, y de Herken, no es que una nota se hace de principio a fin, se publica y después ven qué pasa, sino la idea es, Herken ofrece herramientas que permiten a los periodistas ir tanteando, ir viendo cómo va una noticia y cómo se va desarrollando antes de que esté lista. Esto es bueno por un lado para saber si se está haciendo algo que tiene sentido y que realmente va a tener interés, pero de vuelta, enganchándolo con también lo que decía Amanda antes, uno con esto puede involucrar a las personas a los que se suponía que eran los consumidores del contenido, uno pasa a involucrarlos en la creación del contenido y los tiene enganchados de una manera donde, ya no son de vuelta los simples consumidores, sino también son productores. Y de vuelta, esto es parecido al software y al software libre, y también es parecido a los startups y lean startup, digamos. No hacer una empresa gigante o no hacer un desarrollo enorme y después ver qué onda, sino ir haciendo pequeñas iteraciones y pequeñas modificaciones. Y con eso uno llega a algo que tiene mucho más sentido para los que se supone que iban a consumir nuestro producto, servicio, nota o lo que estamos haciendo. Así que los dejo con Jennifer.
Thank you so much. I wish I knew Spanish well enough to do this in Spanish, so thank you for bearing with me. The title here is Questions Are the New Comments. I will hopefully convince you to believe that by the end of this presentation. But to begin with, I just want to let you know I am making generalizations in this presentation. So not everyone is doing what I'm saying. This is just for the sake of argument. I'm aware of it. So I just wanted to put that out there before I get going. A little bit of background on me. So I've been a journalist for about 10 years, mostly within public media in the United States, mostly with WBEZ, which is a large public media radio station out of Chicago. And I started a series there a few years ago, an experimental news gathering series called Curious City. And then that has since transformed into a technology-enabled company called Herken. And if you see the word Curious City, you might say, oh, that looks like curiosity. That is meant to be that way. It is a play on the word curiosity, and hearken means to listen attentively. And if you break it apart into two different words, you can see hear, which is to listen, and ken is to expand your range of knowledge. So we're really interested about how do we listen to our audience to expand the range of knowledge about them. So this is pretty basic. Something I think we all believe is that journalism needs an audience in order to survive. We need people looking at our stuff, not only for the business model, but also for our morale. But the thing is, journalism puts the audience last, and I'll show you what I mean by that. So traditionally in the journalism story cycle, this is what most newsrooms look like. There's high involvement from the newsroom throughout the whole story cycle, so from reporters, editors, producers, at the pitch phase, at a signing, of course reporting, and then once they hit publish, usually reporters, editors, everyone tends to just drop off. They have another assignment to do, they're moving along. And that's the point when the public can actually get involved. So that's the first point where they get to make any sort of meaningful contribution. And this is the place that they get to usually make it, in the comments section. And I think the fact that we involve them so late is one of the reasons they get so angry, is that they weren't consulted as to whether or not we should have done that story, who we should have talked to, and that kind of thing. So comments are hard. I'm not going to belabor the fact, but a lot of sites have been killing their comment sections lately, and some sites are only allowing comments from time to time. I didn't even have room on a slide to do all the sites that don't offer any comments whatsoever, but there are many of them right now. And I'm just going to go through a few examples of why comments can suck and be very hard. Of course, this is a generalization. Some people are doing it very well. But for the most part, comments can attract and amplify anger. So one person in the comments section who's really pissed off can then lead to 4 people who are all pissed off at each other, can then look like this. And this is difficult to derive value from a bunch of angry people. They're not thinking straight, they're not open to having a dialogue or building understanding. They're just mad at each other, which doesn't really do a journalist a whole lot of good. The other thing is that comments start from a weak framework. So all journalists know that the quality of the answers that you get depend on the quality of the questions that you ask. And what we're doing as journalists is that we're treating our audience very poorly in terms of the comments section. And to give you an example, this is what it would look like if a journalist treated a source like they treat their audience. They would begin, they would start talking, then they would keep talking, then they would keep talking, and they would keep talking, and then they would say, please comment on all of that. That's basically what our stories are doing. They're just treating our audience like, okay, I just gave you a bunch of information, comment on that. Which is another way of asking the question, what do you think? Which is a really shitty question, actually. So weak questions end up leading to weak answers. And the framework for comments is really a weak question of, what do you think? And the other thing is that 65% of people rarely or never comment. This is a US statistic, I'm not sure what it is here. But, so not only are we deriving very little value from the people who are commenting, is that most of the people reading our news are not commenting at all. So we're not getting a fair assessment of what the audience's capabilities are because most of them aren't being there. The other thing is that comments put the public last. So you just saw my slide where they physically put them last at the end of the process of journalism, but they also put them physically last on the page and in the process. So they're frequently below ads at the very bottom of a story in smaller print and kind of relegated off to the side. So a question that I've been asking myself over the last few years is, what if journalism put the public, put the audience, put their communities first? What would that look like? What could that look like? And I've been experimenting with that for a few years at WBEZ and with other newsrooms across the United States. So again, just by way of comparison, the traditional journalism cycle, this is where the audience comes in with comments and sharing. But what I'm calling a public-powered story cycle looks very different. So it's involving the audience, both individuals from the audience and the audience at large, in the story cycle at every major point of the story cycle. So I'll begin with the point of asking questions. So here, what we've been experimenting with is, what would it look like if our stories began with audience questions rather than began with what we thought the audience wanted to know? And just to compare a little bit of what I just talked about, so comments come after the story, questions come before the story. These are fundamentally different frameworks to look at. Comments are usually based on opinion, and questions are based on curiosity, which means comments often come from a closed mind, someone who's already made up the way that they think about how the world works, whereas questions offer this opportunity for understanding and knowledge transfer. Comments tend to be contagious in a negative way, as I showed earlier, whereas questions tend to be contagious in a positive way. If someone asks a really juicy question, even if you've never thought of that question yourself, you probably want to know the answer to it too. That's something that we've been seeing a lot. And like I mentioned, comments are not often all that useful, whereas questions are the backbone of journalism. That's what all of our stories are based on. Here's a quote from a book I just got recently that kind of sums this up, is that storytelling is the act of bringing home the discoveries learned from curiosity. The story is a report from the front lines of curiosity. So every news story implicitly is trying to answer a question, even if it's as simple as what happened yesterday, or what's going on with the Chinese economy, or what's the weather tomorrow, or how did that sports team do yesterday. Every story is answering a question. So Curious City is this experiment that started in 2012 at WBEZ in Chicago that I ran. And what we began by doing is we put a call out to the audience to get their questions. And this is what we essentially asked them. What have you always wondered about Chicago, the region, or its people that you would like this news organization, WBEZ, to investigate? Now, we asked people in lots of different ways. We went out on the street with our microphones, we went to events, we had some digital tools to help us out, and we collected everyone's curiosities as story pitches, basically, for the newsroom. And since this is a radio station, we ended up doing a lot of stories on air and podcasts, and I just wanted to play you a little bit of what this framing sounds like so you can hear the flavor of this. Let's see if that's right.
When were what schools?
Who decides what the next?
Where's that story?
Why they keep the loop?
What is this?
It's Curious City,
where WBEZ answers your questions
about Chicago, the region, and its people.
So that's the way every radio and podcast story would start, with the public's curiosity, with people asking questions about all sorts of things. And what we learned from this experiment is the public is not asking for cat videos or photos of a celebrity's baby or whatever other sorts of stuff we see trending online. They're asking fantastic questions that we don't see covered in the news. Here are just a few examples of the thousands of questions that we've gotten at Curious City. So something really interesting, what's the city's policy on urban hunting? Were there ever pirates on the Great Lakes? The answer is yes. It's a great story. Why are there no public statues of women in Chicago? And what's it like to live on minimum wage in this town? People had a lot of curiosity, but the news organizations weren't feeding those. They were just covering the what's going on, everyone went to the same press conference, everyone's doing the same story over and over again. So what we learned is that by giving the audience this opportunity to participate at the beginning of the story process, is that they could provide newsrooms with a continuous stream of fresh story ideas. And these story ideas are original. These are not the same stories everyone else is doing. These are not trending on Twitter. These are not pulling from big data saying, what's everyone talking about now? They're the thing that starts what everyone begins to talk about. Now, these are also relevant stories because someone is actually asking for the story. It's not us in the newsroom as editors, as reporters saying, I think we should do a story about this because I think people will care. We're actually getting proof that people care before we even start reporting, which means that these stories end up being very popular as well. I like to call the kinds of stories that result from this framework the Holy Grail story because they tend to be original, relevant, and very popular, which all newsrooms are trying to consistently create stories like this, but it's very hard to do. We also learned that stories made from public curiosity perform significantly better. So like I said, they really are popular. And here's an example. So we had a question, what is the origin of the Chicago accent? It was asked by a Chicago citizen, Sarah Lynn Pablo. We ended up doing a few different stories answering this question. And these are the average statistics from those stories. So 11 times more page views than just the regular feature. 9 minutes and 23 seconds on this story compared to an average of 2:44. And these are far more comments than we usually get for our pretty small newsroom. So this is typical actually of the stories produced through Curious City. They are all significantly better than the average. Now, this also led me to think about another part of the journalism process, which is what if the public could not only ask questions, but what if they could assign us stories? So again, they ask questions, but now we offer them the opportunity to vote on their favorites. And what this means is that we can bypass the traditional editorial filters that are in every newsroom about why or why not you should do a story. You don't need to have a story now killed by an editor who says, who cares, or why does this matter, is it timely? The public can tell us instead of one editor's opinion. And we built software, actually. This is some of this is on GitHub, open source, earlier versions of it, so you have a lot of work to do getting it up to speed. But this is an example of WBEZ's website where you can vote on the public's questions to see which stories we should answer. And as journalists, we frequently found out that these were different stories than our editors would have picked, which is very nice. Now, this creates new editorial possibilities in that way, where we don't have to rely on editors to make or break which stories that we do. The public tells us. And then it also leads to authentic and targeted marketing by the people who end up participating. So what we found is when we invite people to participate and we let them know, they end up telling everyone they know. So your brand and your stories travel really far. This is just one example of one woman tweeting about, hey, everyone please vote for my story. I really want to be on the air. I want my story to be there. And this is another tweet from her. She was very excited when her story ended up winning. So people mobilize their communities, which gets your brand and your story out further. So another question I asked myself in this process is, what if the public could also shape reporting? So what if not only could they ask questions and they could assign which questions we do, what if the people whose questions won actually got to physically accompany reporters on stories? And this is something we did. People were very nervous about it at the beginning, but it's been working great. So this is a woman who actually asked a question in the field with the reporter from WBEZ, getting an answer to her story. Now, if you work in software, you work in product development, this is user testing in the field at the time of your creating a story. Journalists don't usually get this. They put their story together, then they put it out, and then they see how it does. This way, they have someone along with them saying, oh, that's interesting. Maybe a reporter didn't think it was that interesting, but to the public, that's something they didn't know, so they'll include it in the story. Now, for the public, when they get to go out with a journalist, they get access to people in places they never would have gotten access to before. Maybe they get to meet the mayor and sit in and see what a day in the life of him is like. They get to go places that as a regular citizen, they don't have the power to go to. And they also get to directly influence the news that they love. Typically a regular member of the public will never make it into the news unless they're a bystander to an event or a witness, or they've done something so horrible or so remarkable that a story ends up being made about them. This is a way of getting regular people involved in the process. So just a quick recap, what's different? So this is a traditional cycle where public can comment, and this is the public-powered story cycle where people get to participate at very different stages of the process. Now, what Hearken is we're scaling up these ideas that we started with Curious City, and we're offering them to newsrooms through a community of best practices and through technology. So what we have right now is a tool set in place. We have this Curiosity module, which is a customizable, embeddable module that newsrooms can change the prompt for what sorts of questions they want to have in. So for instance, this Raise Your Hand is a initiative about education reporting. So they want people's questions about education in New York, where you can change it to say, what do you wonder about energy in the Dakotas? Or what do you wonder about Buenos Aires that you're not seeing covered in the news? These are ways that people can configure and style and embed them all over on their site, wherever they like. We also have these voting modules so that newsrooms can, again, get preferences on which stories the public wants before they report on them. And then we're going to be working on an interactive reporter's notebook this spring so that the public can actually comment on stories while they're being made and help shape them. And one of the reasons we created Hearken is because we started using generic technology like Google Forms, PollDaddy, Wufoo to try and get these questions and try and get these votes. But what we ended up with is what I like to call Spreadsheet Hell. So this is what it looked like when we started collecting and scaling up. Once we got about 100 or so questions, it was unmanageable. We couldn't use it in the newsroom. And a lot of newsrooms who are trying public engagement are finding that it doesn't scale very well because one thing's coming in on a Twitter feed, one thing's coming in on someone else's inbox. No one has a centralized location to actually make sense of and see bigger trends happening in the data. So part of what Hearken offers is this back-end management tool, which can show you what sorts of engagement you're getting and actually categorize it, organize it, and make it usable for your newsroom. So what we've been doing is we've been experimenting with this model around the US, and we have more sites that aren't on here. Also, we have our first Canadian site coming up. And what we found is that people using our framework and model end up asking, again, really excellent questions. Here are just some examples from our partner newsrooms around the United States. And they end up performing significantly higher. So this was not an anomaly at WBEZ. All of these stories ended up doing quite better than the average story. So just to recap, changing the role of the audience changes the role of the public and of journalists. So in this public empowered sort of world versus traditionally, the public is passive, whereas now they're active. They're consuming, and now they're creating. And whereas they had no influence on what stories got reported, now they have a direct line into what stories get reported. Again, this changes the role of journalists, where traditionally they're gatekeepers. With public power, they become a connector or a conduit. Whereas they're authorities and experts, now they're a skilled synthesizer of information. Whereas they're responsible for every part of a story before, now they're just responsible for some parts, doing the actual reporting, making sure the information is correct, and delivering quality products. And whereas journalists are usually working for the public, now they're working with the public. So this is a question that has been dogging me for a few years that I finally feel like I have an answer to. How do journalists know the stories they report are stories their audience wants? If you're a journalist right now, just think real quick, how do you know that the stories you report are ones your audience wants? Well, most people say, I know after the fact. I get metrics. We don't need to wait until after the fact anymore. You can test these ideas beforehand. The answer is ask first and listen. Now, if you're familiar with design thinking, this is design thinking applied to the story scale. So empathizing, defining ideas, ideating, prototyping, and testing. And this is actually something I'll be talking a little bit more about this afternoon. So if you're not familiar with design thinking, please come to the workshop and we can talk about how this works. That's going to be from 5 to 7 tonight in E4. So thanks so much for your time, and I look forward to chatting with you guys throughout the weekend. Thanks.